Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us for our first webinar of 2024. Just before we get started today, I just wanted to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners and elders of the many lands that we're all meeting on today, and to extend a warm welcome to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us in the audience today. My name's Emma. I'm one of the CLE officers here at Legal Aid Queensland, and I'm privileged to live, work and raise my family on the lands of the Yuggera and Turrbal people here in Meanjin in Brisbane, which is also where Paul and I are broadcasting from today. And I apologise for reading, I just want to make sure I get the names right in this section. I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners and elders of the lands that our presenters Bill and Dion are also joining us from. Bill is joining us from the lands of the Woolgooroo Kaba and Bindal people in Townsville, and Dion is joining us from the border of Woiwurrung and Wathiwurrung territories of the Kulin Nation in Victoria. Sorry, I'm talking very fast. I would also just like to acknowledge the valuable contribution Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have made and continue to make to our legal system, and to acknowledge the valuable lessons our sector continues to learn about improving community services from these ancient and knowledgeable cultures. So today our webinar is on disaster legal help and, the webinar today is on disaster legal help, and we're going to be having a panel discussion and Q&A. Our presenters today are Paul Holmes, the Assistant Director of Flood Response at Legal Aid Queensland. We have Bill Mitchell joining us from Townsville Community Law, and Dion Newburn from the Australian Financial Complaints Authority. Just have a little bit of housekeeping to go through with you before we get started today. GoToWebinar is the platform we're using to stream our webinar. It is being recorded, and this webinar will be available on YouTube in the coming days. If you run into any trouble with the platform today, unfortunately, there's not much help that I can give you while we're live. If you just click on to the GoToWebinar customer service tabs, that's also available in the handouts. Speaking of the handouts, there are two little tabs on the panel available for you to interact with us and to see the handouts today. The handouts tab will give you the slides from this webinar and our webinar in 2023. Along with some other great handouts from AFCA. And if you do have questions today, if you can pop those into the questions tab, we'll be able to see those and answer those as we go through. So just have a couple of polls today. It's just going to help us learn where you are and understand who's with us in the room today. So I'll just get started with our first one. This is, which region do you work in? If you can let us know if you're joining us from Southeast Queensland or Far North Queensland, regional Queensland, or outside of Queensland. And while those results are coming in, Paul, could you just let us know if the legislation and policy that we're talking about today is relevant outside of Queensland? And
the answer is the insurance laws and the consumer credit law, for example, are. Most of the family law is. Yep. If we start talking about criminal law, there's different law in each state.
Okay, thank you.
Same with tenancy law.
Okay.
Different law in each state.
Yep. Okay. That will be relevant for a few of our viewers today. I'm just going to close off that poll and share those results for you just for your interest. Most people are joining us from Southeast Queensland, but we do have a fair cohort from regional Queensland and also from outside of Queensland. So welcome everybody. The next poll we're going to jump into is, what is your role? If you could just let us know if you are a support worker or a financial counsellor, a social worker, a lawyer, or if you are none of those things. Lots of financial counsellors or health and education workers joining us today. Also lots of lawyers and lots of people who don't fit into any of those categories. Everybody is welcome, and we hope that you find the information that we're sharing in this webinar today really useful. I'll just close that poll off now. Thank you so much for your responses. Just sharing those for your interest for a couple of seconds there, just so you can also see who's in the room. We are going to go straight through to another poll. This one is going to help us frame our answers today. Help our presenters frame their answers, just to understand what your level of experience is with natural disasters. With people who have been impacted by disaster. So most of the people in the room today either are helping people who have been impacted or have previously helped people who were impacted. But we're also seeing a number of people in the room who themselves have been impacted, and thank you for joining us today. I really hope you find some useful information from our session. I'm just going to close that poll off now. I'm not going to share those ones with you, we'll just keep those for our information there. And the last one we have is, how much experience do you have helping people, with legal issues following disaster? Strong response there of, oh no, we've got some shifting around now. So there's some falling in most of the categories there. All right, thank you so much everybody for your responses today. So I will just hand over now to our presenters. Thanks, Paul.
Right. Excellent, and thank you again to both Bill and Dion for joining us. Just really quickly, the sorts of issues we're going to try and cover today are the key legal issues following a disaster, which is beyond insurance, the key insurance issues we find, AFCA processes, and some specifics around scope of works, cash settlement, and temporary accommodation. I would encourage you to put questions in as we go, because that will allow us to answer them as we're dealing with the particular issues, which will help us all. All right, moving to the next slide. We just wanted to give you all a bit of an idea. No, it's
Sorry, yeah, I'm just having trouble hiding the polls. Sorry. I apologise, everybody. It seems to be frozen on the poll side. If anybody can let me know if you can see our slides rather than the polls. Okay, we might just move forward. Sorry, everybody. I apologise for this. Thank you. Sorry, Paul.
That's right. We can continue talking or you continue playing. Just to give everybody an idea of the sorts of things that has happened in the last 3 months. We've had bushfires, cyclones, flooding, storms, a tornado, a second cyclone, more flooding in Brisbane and Sunshine Coast, and then numerous severe storms right around the breadth of Queensland. I know Victoria's had Valentine's Day storms that knocked out the power. New South Wales has been affected by both bushfires and flooding. Northern Territory has been affected by flooding. WA has been affected by flooding and heat waves. The climate's very unhappy with us. And I think to set the scene, I'll hand over to Bill to talk through Townsville's experience, because Townsville, unfortunately, has been a hotspot for disasters in recent times.
Thanks, Paul. I'll just wait for those slides to come up. Look, thanks very much for asking me along here today. Can I also acknowledge that I'm on Gurungal Barra, which is the lands of the Wulgurukaba, Bindal, Nuwagi and Gugu Barden peoples, and I pay my respects to them. Can I also acknowledge that First Nations people have a very different experience of disasters? It's very important that we make more efforts, I think, as legal service and other service providers to ensure that we are targeting those communities in our response, both short and long-term responses, because I think that certainly First Nations communities are often in places that are disproportionately affected by disasters, and also have disproportionate experience of disasters in all of the phases. Can I just, you can see for your own interest the experience we've had. We get a disaster about every couple of years. Personally, I've worked since the first experience was severe tropical cyclone Justin in 1997. So we've had many, many examples of disaster legal assistance. Of course, predominantly examples of cyclones and flooding events. We don't have much experience of bushfires, but increasingly, including late last year, we did in fact have some serious bushfires threatening the surrounding areas to Townsville. So that was a new experience for us. And I guess that with the way climate is and the crisis we're experiencing, it's very important that we be prepared for whatever might come our way and not be relaxed and comfortable about our previous experience. We need to be prepared for other things happening. Those collective experiences there are quite instructive for us because they've taught us a few things, and I'm not going to labour on today about the details of disaster legal responses. I'm just going to have some key snippets. If I can go to the next slide, thanks. There is a recurring deja vu, which has become more common for us. And this is an email that I wrote to a colleague in legal aid 13 years ago, which said, you know, there will be a national report on bushfire legal help, which is referring to the Victorian bushfires at the time. We were looking down the barrel of a tropical cyclone that weekend, and again, we're hopelessly prepared for it. And when I say we, I mean collectively service providers, not just legal service providers, but service providers more broadly speaking, including financial counsellors, community centres, neighbourhood centres, and a range of other advocacy organisations. I think we're still in that place where we are collectively unprepared. We certainly, the last 15 years has meant that individual organisations have become better prepared to deal with these issues. There are some statewide plans and services in place, but really we still are yet to join up properly in effective partnerships that mean we can respond in a collective and equitable way. And I think it's important to emphasise the critical need to be equitable in our response. Disaster legal help research across the world tends to show that wealthy people get disaster assistance first and poor people get it last, if at all. So in the back of my mind is always we need to be thinking that how can we ensure an equitable response to a disaster, a critical issue. Next slide, thanks. So with that, here's a photograph of the 2019 floods in Townsville, a major intersection travelling south. And in effect, that flooding event meant that people were stranded, people couldn't move around, and it's really just a metaphor for where to from here in terms of our collective services and our approach. I think if we can go to the next slide, it might just be worthwhile running through some of those key lessons. As we've noted from Paul's just the most recent experiences we've had in the state, something is happening somewhere every day. And so there is, in fact, disasters occurring almost all the time, it seems now. And that can get distracting and can get difficult. It can be also very triggering for people who've been through a disaster. And so I know in Townsville, whenever there's a cyclone off the coast or monsoonal flooding on its way, there are large numbers of people who are experiencing great levels of anxiety and psychological distress because of their previous experiences. And as climate has become more unpredictable, this has heightened our anxiety and heightened our concerns. But importantly, every disaster is different, even when they occur in the same place. And I can't stress this enough, that there is no one-size-fits-all response. It can be different every time. In fact, the experience of even repeated events such as cyclones and bushfires will provide different effects, will affect different groups of people, and might affect the same groups of people in different ways. So we also can't be too fixed in our views about what sorts of matters we might see. We can certainly take account of the data that tells us what we can expect, but we also need to expect the unexpected. And we need to be thinking about which groups of our own we might focus on to assist. Really, it's important if you're coming from an organisation to question whether that organisation has service continuity planning at its heart. It's important to know what your service will do in a disaster. How will it plan to continue a service? How will it plan to support staff who will inevitably be affected by the same disaster as the community that they're serving? Advance notice is obviously helpful, and in cyclone season we do get some advance notice. We can see it off the coast and we can track its movements with great concern. And so that's the time when you should be asking your employer or asking your colleagues, are we ready for this? Are we ready to, say, work from home if need be? Are we ready to think about what adjustments we might need to make for staff who are affected? Have we thought about our current clients who might be more severely impacted than others? So advance notice is helpful, but of course we don't always get that. It's really important to track where your clients are and think about who's going to be affected. And if you have a target demographic or a target cohort, then it's important to think about how they might be affected and think about how you might pick up on those issues, both in the immediate aftermath, but probably more importantly in the short term and the long tail that disasters bring. It's also important to get involved in networks. Your peak body is important because they may already have some ideas about how to approach these things, but also to think about any disaster planning processes that might be occurring at local level. It's also very important to remember that the legal and related issues that arise from disaster do not all present immediately. They present over a complex time frame. There are some things that come immediately. There are some things that are in the short term, and I would say the short term is the immediate response phase, where people are cleaning up and getting their claims done or getting their life back in order, going back to work, re-establishing their life. And then there's a long-term issues. And the research out of Hurricane Katrina in the US, which impacted very seriously on New Orleans, showed that, in fact, people were still experiencing legal issues a decade after Katrina went through. So there's a very long tail. And the biggest part of that you need to be aware of if you're dealing with clients who are vulnerable, for want of a better word, is that they will have trouble becoming resilient. And so the next disaster that comes along may set them back further from where they are. So we need to also have an eye always to our clients' ability to build resilience, to make sure we're looking out for resilience grants, or any processes or services that you can provide that build resilience, whether that's community awareness, community education, group work, and there's any number of things that can be done. So I think it's important to look for opportunities, not only to plan and respond when something happens, but also to assist in the preparation for later disasters, because we know it's a cycle, and so it might have happened and we're all happy that it's finished or we've cleaned up, but it's going to happen again. Next slide, thanks. So I wanted to touch just lastly before we go back to Paul, I think, on immediate needs, because this is an area that is, this is our principal concern when things happen. What will we see in the immediacy of, or the aftermath of a disaster? Well, we're going to see displacement. People are going to have housing issues, and those who have mobility issues will face certain isolation. And that is not only social isolation, but isolation from critical needs such as medical appointments or pharmaceuticals. They will lose support programs and all the things that impact on staff that means they can't do their job has a knock-on effect for people who are isolated. So if we're going to pick one group of our clients that we should think very carefully about, it ought to be those who are going to face some level of social isolation. They will also have, in our experience, the highest level of anxiety and concern about their situation going forward. Obviously, there are some survival issues around financial impacts, including the ability to get payments from government, state and federal, or there could be disruptions to employment. And for people who work in the informal or gig or contracted economy, these things can be even worse. So while disasters impact on the businesses that employ or contract them, they often have no earning capacity whatsoever. Obviously impacts significantly on families in terms of schooling, but also extended care arrangements. There are many services that offer respite or care that will be affected by a disaster. And so again, we need to be thinking about what are the flow-on effects, no pun intended, from a natural disaster. There's an increasing awareness that there is a heightened prevalence or amplification of interpersonal violence during and after disasters. That is absolutely correct. And all forms of interpersonal violence are affected by this. Domestic and family violence, elder abuse, carer, neglect and abuse. So everything reaches a critical stage during and after disaster. And so we also need to be ensuring that we are aware of this being a very clear disaster legal need or a disaster need. There are, of course, health impacts, and I would say the trauma experienced by people during disaster is the principal impact. Some people struggle to address and resolve that trauma over time, but we need to remember that when we're dealing with people during and after disasters, the impacts of trauma will be with them, and that will be all of the things that we know to be true about clients affected by trauma, including their memory, their ability to be organised, their their approach to us and their attention to detail. So all the things we know affect people through trauma will also be in place here. There's some very practical things that happen to people, including loss of paperwork, but also getting paperwork done, insurance claims, grants applications, all sorts of stuff. Again, think about what your service can offer, and these very practical steps that are necessary to get people back on track. One takeaway for you today from me, and it'll be my last point, is that if you can, from the work you do, have a look at the data that comes after you've done this work and think about what were the trends that we saw, what were the commonalities. Does that give us some basis to plan for a future response? Does that give us some information about how to identify future clients? And more importantly, does that give us some insight into how our service provision can be honed to be most effective in that immediate, short-term and longer-term response? I think that's all I had, Paul, so I'll hand back over to you.
Thank you for setting the scene so beautifully there, Bill. That big picture stuff's really important. Just moving now to delve into some of the issues that you identified. And on the next slide, I set out what the common legal issues we tend to see are. But for the purpose of this webinar, I think we're going to focus on the insurance issues, acknowledging that there is a segment of our community that for insurance, they can't actually afford it anymore. And we need to think about our responses to how we are going to appropriately help them in the context of financial hardship, assisting with government grants and associated things like that. Because as Bill identified, they are often the poorest in our community and they need the same service as anybody else who has insurance does. All right, let's talk about the key insurance issues and get on the next slide if we could, please. And most recently, the key things we've been seeing, and I'm happy to be directed by the audience as to where we start on these, but communication, quality of reports by experts, wear and tear, and maintenance exclusions. I'm hearing a lot about those. Affordability and underinsurance, temporary accommodation, and generated claims, and linked to temporary accommodation and is the idea of cash settlements and scope of works. Now, in that context, I guess for those of you who've not been involved in this area before, it's probably worth starting with the insurance claims process, which we have on the next slide, just to give everybody that perspective about where we're headed and what we're doing. That is basically the insurance claims process in a nutshell on that slide. Key bits to note about that is they don't have to happen in sequential order. You can potentially have 1, 2, 3 happening at the same time. You can have points 4 and 5 happening at the same time. But Dion, it's fair to say you can't do 7 before you do 6. You've got to go through internal dispute resolution before anybody can come to you. Would that be fair?
Yeah, look, I mean, generally, it's, if you can hear me, it's our view that it's appropriate and it's sensible because, you know, many times an insurer will actually be able to resolve a complaint relatively quickly internally, which saves time and effort in coming to AFCA and lodging a complaint. I mean, you can come to AFCA at any time, and part of our process is to refer complaints back to financial firms. And, you know, in that period around in the insurance industry, around 40% of complaints are actually resolved in that first refer back period. So, you know, again, our advice is to use internal dispute resolution first. However, you can lodge a complaint with AFCA at any time.
Okay. And I guess to start with one of the legal issues we're seeing a fair bit of, let's start with wear and tear and maintenance. I know from speaking to community workers and financial counsellors and clients, it feels like there's a lot of claims out there that are denied because either a roof hasn't been adequately maintained or a wall hasn't been adequately maintained, or there's wear and tear to a property. In that respect, the view I start from is that's an exclusion from the insurance policy. And what that means, in my view, is an insurer needs to prove that they can rely on that exclusion. And what we see, and I don't know if Africa and Bill, you see something similar, and we've got a comment in the chat, guys, that had an initial claim for carpet replacement denied because the carpet was old, which I think highlights the problem we see with this at the moment. Just because something's old doesn't mean it hasn't been properly maintained.
Yeah, I've had a couple of questions come through again before the webinar started about when an insurer or grant body deems that damage is pre-existing as well. Which
is the same sort of idea.
Okay.
So I guess that's the perspective I come from, and what we see a lot of, Dion, and I don't know if AFCA sees the same, is expert reports that say the roof hasn't been maintained. They don't give you any more detail, and then the insurance claims officer denies the claim.
Yeah, I mean, this is an issue we commonly deal with, and obviously AFCA's role as an independent organisation is to review the material, and as you said, many times it's a situation where the insurance company may be relying on an exclusion where they have the onus effectively to establish that exclusion on the balance of probabilities, and on an individual complaint we'll look at the evidence that's presented in support of that, and I guess that the meat is in that part. How convincing is that report? Does it adequately establish that there is wear and tear and or maintenance issue and or the damage predated the loss? That is the sort of area, I suppose, that where we work. There'll be differing views on that, and through the AFCA process, customers and complainants and people representing complainants have the opportunity to respond to technical reports, and sometimes that may be in the form of, well, the person didn't actually even get up on the roof, they didn't actually look at it adequately. There's those types of issues that we commonly comments that we often see. In some customers, whilst it can be prohibitive because of cost, some customers may have withdrew a quote an alternate opinion. So obviously, his role is to balance the evidence that's before us, or the information that's before us, and make a decision, based on the terms of the policy and the evidence that's presented, or the information that's presented.
Speaking about evidence that's presented, what sort of evidence can somebody provide to dispute an insurance claim? Can we use webcam footage?
Absolutely. And I know, Bill, you and I have discussed this before. Webcam footage is great evidence that people sometimes lead. Their own personal experience of what they saw and heard is another great example. What else comes to mind for you, Bill?
Look, I think one of the most useful generators of evidence is Facebook. Certainly during the 2019 monsoon, much of the discussion around what was occurring in streets and blocks and suburbs was on community pages on Facebook, and any number of people collected fantastic evidence from other people who were affected. So I think, despite the ills of social media, it is a great place to collect relevant evidence at times, and certainly that we always keep an eye on social media during disasters, because that's where most of the commentary is. So yeah, a range of places. Of course, the proper evidence that is needed, such as hydrography reports and those sorts of things, are more difficult to obtain because they're expensive. But again, it only takes one person in a neighbourhood often to get that evidence, and it's useful for everybody.
And the other side of that coin is we've certainly had cases in the past where people, what they saw directly contradicted what the hydrology report had said, because while hydrology is good evidence, it's not foolproof. And so that's worth remembering too in that context.
That's correct. Yeah. Sorry, Paul. And I think on that point, I think Bill makes a very good point there about, most people today have a phone with some sort of camera on it, not everyone obviously. And, we are presented often with information, water surcharging out of toilets or water surcharging out of drains, and it may be been obtained by a neighbour or someone on the street. So that's obviously valid. Another thing I would say from an AFCA perspective, just because there is a technical or an expert report provided, we're not necessarily going to accept that if we don't find it convincing. You know, if there is, you know, video information or statements and other information that we believe convincingly indicates that there are doubts about the conclusions of the report. And sometimes some of the comments within the report, commenting on the age of a home, commenting on you know, maybe the rainfall and things, if some of that info, although even particularly with flood, the height of the floor height of the home, some of that information is actually incorrect. It certainly may be something that we take into account when we sort of balance the you know, the validity of the report.
Another good example of that we're seeing currently following the tornado in southeast Queensland is reports relying on wind speeds of an area that's 30 or 40 kilometres away as the crow flies, which isn't necessarily reflective of the person's actual experience where they were. And that's, I guess, the same sort of thing you're talking about.
Yeah, and that type of thing, you know, they can all be factors that are relevant, and obviously that's why it's important, you know, when a you know, speaking to somebody who has a issue with their claim about, you know, gathering as much information as possible that they may have available. And obviously there are barriers to that when the homes had water gone all the way through it. But certainly those types of things can be very, very useful. And also, I will be fair, useful to insurers as well. Sometimes if that information is presented to the insurer, it may actually allow them to re-review the complaint through internal dispute resolution. So it's not just about AFCA. I think this information presented to an insurer can actually quite convincingly convince them that maybe they need to relook at their decision.
Or in some cases get a second report, which has happened for a number of our clients. And that's a really important part, I think. Keep those questions coming through. The other thing I would say about maintenance that I think is worth us discussing is, does anybody actually know on the panel what you need to do to adequately maintain your property? Because I'm not sure I do.
No.
And to me, that's one of the problems with that as an exclusion. If we're going to have that in an insurance policy and an expectation that we all have to maintain our house, I think one of the things globally we need to work on is, what actually does that look like? And what expectations do we have of your regular homeowner who might not be a chippy, might not be a roofer, might not be a builder? What do we reasonably expect them to be on the lookout for, or what do we reasonably expect them to have to do in terms of bringing in tradespeople to adequately maintain their house? Because I regularly get clients who say, but I got a building inspection 18 months ago when I built the house, and when I bought the house, and there was no problem.
What sort of issues are you seeing specifically? Can you think of any that insurers have rejected as pre-existing or?
Look, so the common issues in Queensland, and I suspect this is the case in Townsville too, Bill, we see a lot of question marks over stumps and how you adequately protect a stump from wear and tear. Don't know if you see that in Townsville.
Look, possibly. I think it's less it's less about the actual maintenance issue and more about how sharp the insurer is going to be on their inspection.
Yeah.
If I can take the moment to say that I think reasonable maintenance really has an element that is about how reasonable it is for the person. It's not just about whether it's reasonable to get on your roof every 3 years to check the cyclone bolts. It's also an issue of how affordable it is for people and how often they can make it happen. So now I know there's, that's not a simple answer, but I think you do need to delve into the person's circumstances. And people will often have things checked. If disasters are frequent, then people may not have even had an opportunity to do something in between times. So what is reasonable for one person is not necessarily reasonable for another person. So it's a broad argument that can be had. Look, I think it's also fair to say that it's great to see insurers not really relying on definitional debates as often as they had, but they have fallen to other things like reasonable maintenance as a stopgap in many ways. So I think probably there ought to be some more guidance on what is reasonable maintenance. And I don't know if anything's been done recently, Paul, you would know, but
it's certainly something we've suggested to the insurer that collectively both the insurers and consumer groups need to work on.
Yeah.
And I agree completely with your points.
Look, it's also important because these things have a knock-on effect for people's resilient grants applications. And so it's, you know, their ability to get, if they're uninsured and they have to get help from a grant process, often they will have to turn their mind to exactly the same questions. So it's not only insurers that rely on these types of issues. Sorry, I'll leave you, go back to AFCA.
No, I agree. I agree that they're excellent points you raise. And in the context of grants, I think that's probably a nice segue to one of the other issues we see a lot of, and that is people don't understand cash settlements and scope of works and how they work. And for those online, the big thing I'm going to say up front, that as a general rule, people don't know, if you have a client accepting or considering accepting a cash settlement and they have a mortgage, they need to talk to their mortgage holder, because nearly all mortgages have a clause in them that says words to the effect of, if the person gets a cash settlement, it needs to be sent to the bank or lender holding the mortgage. And I can't see any faces, but I usually get shocked faces when I say that out loud.
And that's correct, Paul. And I would say from an AFCA, I mean, having been at AFCA and the predecessor scheme for 15 years, you know, that is something that commonly occurs. But I would say it's rare that we see a problem with that from the mortgage provider, where suddenly there's a stop put on repairs or anything like that. Obviously, if the money's adequate to repair the property, you know, that normally there's an arrangement made that works. But it is an important point, which I think a lot of people don't understand.
I agree. But speaking more broadly about cash settlements, people have a choice, or insurers have a choice, either to repair a property following damage or paying the money out. And that's what we call cash settlements. I see a mix of what happens, and I'm sure you two both see the same. We see properties being repaired. We see people on the other extreme accepting a full cash settlement for all their damage. And we see people in the middle who have their claims partially approved, so they get a partial payout and they're expected to fix the damage for the rest. One of the things about cash settlements, from my perspective, is it relies on the scope of works being really good. And the scope of works is something people struggle with, I find, because it's a technical building document as a general rule that lists every single thing that a builder would have to do in order to put the house back in the place that it was in prior to the disaster occurring. So that can sometimes, I think I've seen 40 and 50-page scope of works. Don't know if AFCA and various sense is similar.
Yeah, there's varying detail. Some will literally, you know, outline every nail that needs to go in. Others may be a little bit broader, but you're correct. It's a challenging space for people. And with cash settlements, you know, obviously one of the really important things about it is, and you know, I go out to communities that have been affected by disasters and talk to people, and they may say, look, I'm considering taking a cash settlement. That can actually be a suitable thing for people to choose if they're a builder or they've got a family member who's a builder, and they feel comfortable that they can adequately manage the job in a timely manner. That can actually be a suitable way to resolve a claim for them. But other times, you know, the risk, I guess, of opting to take a cash settlement from an insurer is there's that transfer of risk of managing the job, and obviously the risk if things go wrong with the quality of that repair work. So it can be an effective resolution method at times for certain individuals, depending on the circumstances. But obviously, it is important to be well aware of what that means and that transfer of risk. You know, insurers, certainly complaints that go through AFCA, will often put on an additional sum for contingencies and that transfer of risk that may be anywhere between 5, 10 to 20% of the claimed amount. And in many instances, from my experience, insurers will also say, look, if in the middle of that work you remove a wall and something else significant is found that you believe is as a result of that claim, we will reassess that and consider that on its merits. And I think generally that's the experience that we see. But certainly it's good to be aware that the transfer of risk is going to that client. And obviously, the reality is we see with cash settlements, particularly in regions where there's high demand, costs of building have gone up significantly. Timber, tiles, all the building elements. There's been shortages in Australia over the last couple of years. So the cost of repairs has gone up significantly. So it is something to be, it can be a very suitable resolution method, but it's something to be very mindful of. There are also situations, of course, where there's an interplay between a covered event and an excluded event due to, say, maintenance, where it might actually be the most suitable way to resolve a complaint. But obviously making sure that again, to your point, Paul, that there's a solid scope of works there, that we're comfortable as best we can be that the works stated and quoted can be done. And when AFCA looks at cash at issues around generally the cost of repairs, we're usually looking at actionable quotes. So we're saying to insurers, if you're providing a quote, it's on the basis that we believe this repairer is actually willing to do the work for that amount, not just theoretically willing to do the work. So I think it's fair to say the industry is pretty much on board with that now. But it is a bit of it's something to be very, very careful with. So it's a good point you raised, Paul, about being very mindful of what you're getting into.
And I guess the point that follows on from that is be wary of door knockers, because invariably following disasters, you get people come out of the woodwork, knock on your door and go, oh, we can do it for 20 grand, and either don't show up after you pay the deposit or do the work and it's not to standard. And there's a problem when you do the work and it's not to standard, and about whether the insurer will reinsure you. So you might end up with, sorry, go on.
There's a real problem with people who have damage to motor vehicles. Often if it's a family car, the insured value is nowhere near what they need to replace the car or get a similar second-hand or new vehicle. And I think cash settlements can be very problematic, where people don't realise there are very long wait times for repairs, for parts and servicing. So I think there's often often a push to cash settle on a motor vehicle, depending on your policy, of course. But I'd certainly say if any of the audience has families who have that depend on a single vehicle that's severely damaged, then you really do need to maximise the outcome for that client, because it's very easy to wind up with a second best outcome in those situations. And we've found this is quite often really problematic for families where extended family rely on one vehicle. So it might be a van or something, or it could be a vehicle that has special modifications for someone with disability, or any number of other iterations that occur. So it's not just housing insurance contracts that are problematic, it's really insurance across the board, including the kind of small number of tenants who don't have houses but have contents insurance. It's also critically important that they maximise, they've taken the time and the probably unaffordable step of having contents insurance. So it's really important they understand how to maximise the outcomes from those policies if they have a claim.
Good call, Bill. And I think too, this is the type of issue that AFCA deals with quite regularly. Scope, disputes around scope of works, as in what is the appropriate scope of works, what maintenance may or may not be included within that, but also claim amount. Where it may be that a customer has a quote for hypothetically $200,000, the insurance company saying we can do that work for $180,000 or $170,000. So obviously they always turn on their evidence and actionable quotes and things like that. But it's a fair call. And with motor vehicles, particularly since COVID, the cost of secondhand vehicles, as we've all probably seen, is for a period particularly went really high, and that did, to your point, Bill, cause some major issues for people that got cash settlements for secondhand cars.
I think that's still an ongoing problem, although they've dropped a little bit. It's still an ongoing problem you've raised there. Interesting questions come through, which we'll go through. And it's a question around, if somebody takes a cash settlement, do they actually have to repair the property, or are they able to sell and use the income that's left over to buy a further property? I think that's common following bushfires, where people just can't stand the possibility of possibly having their house burnt down again in that area, and they sell the property up and move somewhere else. Would that be fair, do you think? A reasonable thing to do, to take a cash settlement in those circumstances?
I mean, what I would say to that is that's obviously for the individual to decide. And as you say, there's certainly with climate change and the recurrence of these events and some of the locations that we're seeing it all around Australia, that people are where they can, and obviously that can be prohibitive as well, but where they can doing that. I mean, obviously, if you're taking a cash settlement, you do need to inform that mortgage holder if indeed there is a mortgage, because obviously that could be a conversation around what are you planning to do, and would that mortgage be discharged, etc. But obviously that's a conversation in itself. But you know, people do that, and I've not seen personally examples where insurance companies are getting in the way of that, or not sort of covering or offering a cash settlement in those situations. But again, it's obviously a call for the individual, and particularly with respect to mortgage, and making sure that that's all in flow. It's probably more of one to seek their own advice on. Paul?
Absolutely, I agree with that. What I wanted to move to now, that I think is a really important thing that we get a lot of questions about, are communication and delays. That's certainly something that pops up. And just before I move to that, there's been a point come through about how the Queensland buyback scheme interplays with cash settlements. Happy to take that question offline if you've got any specific questions, because delving into the buyback scheme now is probably beyond our time limits, but it's a good point you've raised. But on communication and delay, we've still got, I think the figure I heard this morning was on the news, some 7,000 claims from the 2022 floods unresolved. And I'm certainly still dealing with clients from the 2019 Townsville floods. That seems a really long time for people to not have their insurance dealt with. Am I being unreasonable there?
I don't think so. Sorry, Bill, I'll refer to you.
No.
And look,
I agree.
what I can say on that, I mean, complaints coming into AFCA around delay post February 2022 have gone up significantly. For anyone who's looked at what we've published, it's been a major issue for us, and it is often around communication. Obviously, with COVID, there has been some things that have impacted the insurance industry around the availability of parts and labour, and I think that they are valid points as well. But I think the things that we've talked about is the fact that when we've had a major disaster like this, it's not just the storm-related complaints that have gone up, it's actually complaints around business as usual claims as well. So that's the sort of point that we've been making around the performance. And as you know, there's a parliamentary inquiry at the moment. I think AFCA's actually talking about that today around some of the things that we've experienced. But yes, delays have been a big issue. I mean, when we talk about delays, though, particularly from an AFCA perspective, it's usually delay, but then another issue, such as then followed by a denial or a scope of works issue or some other type of issue. But certainly I'm aware, I was out in Rochester in Victoria on a couple of occasions, and speaking to people who said they were sitting on the side, they're truck drivers, they're in the middle of trying to do their job, they're pulled over for 3 hours trying to get hold of someone on a call, and obviously the frustration and the impact that has on people's ability to just get on with their lives. So it is a big issue. There's definitely been some challenges in the industry with respect to claim volumes and things, but certainly I think if you've seen what's been said at the parliamentary inquiry, there's certainly a focus on delays and communication as a general rule.
May I just pop in and ask, has there been issues with delays where somebody has been through a disaster, lodged a claim, had a delay, and then another disaster has hit their property? And how does that impact then on further claims?
It does.
Yep.
And look, to be honest, the many delays in regional places are caused in small strata title complexes, and we're not talking about the fancy riverside units. I'm talking about duplexes and 4-packs, and many of the people who own those or are paying those off are principally older women. Was the client group we had who were very poorly affected because, of course, you need the entire complex to make a claim, or in some cases you do anyway. And so there can be delay because of the politics around who was affected most, or is it worth making a claim depending on what's got to be paid. So I think it is important to look at the reasons for delay in a lot of these cases. They're not always about the insurer. Often it is the claim being made in the first place. Common property issues, personal property issues can become quite complex. Even in small strata title complexes can be really problematic.
That's another excellent point. And I guess focusing just on the insurer delay for just a second before we move on, the phrase I've used with the insurers, which I think is right, is do what you say you're going to do, because most people are pretty forgiving if you keep them updated about what's happening, why it's happening, and when you're going to do something about it. It's when you tend to get radio silence back from the insurer. I've had a number of clients say words to the effect of, I've called them 18 times and they've called me back twice. And that's, as much as anything, indicative of the trauma the clients are suffering following a disaster, and the idea that if somebody's not contacting me, something must be wrong. And I think that's probably a really important takeaway for all of us and for insurers, that is that trauma-informed approach to helping people following disasters. Just reminding, if anybody's got questions that we haven't answered yet, pop them in the chat so we can answer them in the last 10 minutes as we're talking. One other issue I wanted to talk about is temporary accommodation and accommodation more generally. Accommodation is something that people really struggle with following a disaster because there's already a housing crisis, and I'm happy to call it that. And then you take more houses offline for accommodation. People struggle, even if they're insured, people struggle to find somewhere to live.
Oh, there's a range of predatory practices that occur with landlords as well, where they boot their tenants out so they can rent them to people who have insurance money. And if you have a disaster in a place like Mackay, which has 0 vacancies, it's a major social issue. So we certainly did see a number of temporary accommodation issues that were both at that end of people arguing about whether they should get very well paid expensive accommodation. And we saw some people who are uplifted into fairly fancy places because that's all that was available. But we also saw the tougher end where you had tenants on low incomes with leases terminated, and then those places being rented out for pretty significant amounts based on the insurance money. So I think there's a number of aspects to this issue, but certainly some places are affected very badly. And I would say, in my experience, Mackay is definitely one of the worst for that. Townsville's gotten pretty bad as well, as has most of the state.
And the other instance that happens in that respect, and we've certainly talked to clients along these lines, is every time there's a long weekend, school holidays or public holidays, they have to move accommodation because the hotel accommodation they're in is booked for the school holidays. And that sort of social dislocation is really hard to overcome.
Definitely. It's really difficult issue, and it's a difficult, with accommodation in some of these smaller areas where they're just, as you say, that everything is booked out. And look, we've seen examples of insurers, looking to do different things, such as in some instances purchasing caravans for people on rural properties who have animals and things like that, which seems to be in some instances is suitable for certain people. But obviously the other thing that comes through with temporary accommodation is limits and policies on that. And generally when things have come to AFCA, if there have been significant delays at the insurer's end, in fairness, I think most insurers have extended accommodation beyond those limits to account for that. And I think, generally the industry's done that quite well. But obviously, any time we've had to make a decision about that, if there are delays because of the insurer, we've normally said, well, you need to extend that accommodation to account for that beyond. So, but again, I think generally the industry's dealt with that well. But again, the real problem right now is just actually getting somewhere, which is no easy answer to.
I think you're right about that. And one of the interesting solutions we saw following the tornadoes up here was people, rather than relying on this, just went and bought generators. Because some of the areas that were affected were on reticulated sewage and reticulated water, which meant if they had no power, that also meant they had no sewage and they had no water. And so rather than claiming temporary accommodation, they've been attempting to claim generators and fuel. And for the most part, the insurers, with I think one exception comes to mind, have been paying those claims, which I think is appropriate, given they would have, I think, been able to claim temporary accommodation had they not bought the generators. And I'm assuming, and I'm also starting to see those claims following Cyclone Jasper as well, which seemingly are being paid too. Haven't seen anything from Kirrily yet, Bill.
I don't think you will.
Okay.
I think the impact of Kirrily was really as a Cat 1 crossing the coast. So whilst there's some damage associated with it, nothing like a Category 2 or 3.
Okay.
Fence is down. Fence is down, I'd say, is the lots of trees down, but yeah, still the same stress leading up to it though, and I think that's the point I'd make about. I guess a final point I would make from my perspective is that we do need to understand that people living in disaster-affected areas, which is a lot of the country now, are very stressed because what used to be the holiday season is now firmly the disaster season. That is summer, and then of course it dries off, and we have the ongoing effects of bushfires and other things. So we're living in a stressed environment because of those issues. I think we need to keep that in mind.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it's interesting you mentioned fencing. Fencing is something, and I know it's not Dion's remit, but fencing, we get lots of questions about following disasters. The short answer is if a fence you share with somebody else is damaged, generally speaking, what happens is the two insurers split the cost. And generally speaking, an insurer does not have an obligation to take down trees preemptively for you. That's the householder's responsibility. That's very general. There are exceptions to that, but that's the 30-second version on fencing for people who might be interested. All right, we've probably got 2 or 3 minutes to go. So if there's any final questions or any questions people have, now's the time to pop them through. But the only thing I think we haven't covered is the idea of financial hardship following disasters. And I think the really important takeaway here is this might appear at any point between 2 or 3 months after disaster and 3 to 5 years after a disaster. And we certainly see clients in that 5-year bracket who still haven't recovered. And I imagine you'd still be seeing them in Townsville, Bill.
Yeah.
So our advice there is if somebody's in trouble, ask for help, because nearly always there's a program within the bank, the lender, the council, and utility companies designed to help, but they don't know if you don't tell them. And in some cases, if it's a couple of years afterwards, the reality is sometimes they've forgotten in between that disaster and the other 15 or 20 that have happened in the meantime. So it's important. My takeaway is communication with everybody is a really important aspect of this, because that's generally speaking how people know what's going wrong and how to help you. Dion or Bill, do you have any final thoughts to add?
Just again, with respect to AFCA, for those that that haven't used our services before or don't know a lot about AFCA, you know, it's a free service for consumers. I think it's really important to note there's no cost to a consumer to come. You don't need to be represented by a lawyer that you're paying for. I think, yeah, there's the screenshot there. Free for consumers, we're independent, so we don't take sides. Alternative to the court, decision making based on the principles of fairness. And obviously another thing is that the majority of the complaints that come to AFCA are resolved without the need for a formal decision. We do have the ability to make determinations. Those determinations, if a customer's happy with it, are binding on the insurer. But certainly, you know, through negotiation, through refer back to insurers and other methods, the majority of the complaints that come to us are resolved without the need for a decision. So I think that's an important thing to flag. The other thing, just with respect to financial difficulty, obviously AFCA also deals with banking and has a financial difficulty team. So, you know, many of you will be aware of that, but obviously, you know, we're there for those situations as well. So if you go to our website, there's plenty of information on there around, you know, how to lodge complaints and you know, people can be represented by financial counsellors and, you know, support workers and others if they choose to be, but also, you know, we try to be as accessible as possible. So you know, people don't need to be experts. They simply need to tell us what their perspective is and give us the information they have, and we work with them to try and, you know, fill the gaps and come to a fair resolution.
Okay, and one final couple of questions that have come through. Council rates, they don't have to put a hold on interest, and unfortunately, my experience is they don't when somebody's disaster affected. And then one final one for you, Dion. How does AFCA sit when a hardship arrangement has ended and the creditor expects additional payments to be caught up very quickly versus capitalising the debt at the end? That's probably, I know you're not your area.
I might jump in there also and just say that this one, while Dion's thinking about his answer, may be answered next month in our financial hardship webinar, which will be on March 22nd. Dion, did you have?
Yeah, look, I'll be honest, I probably wouldn't be best placed to answer that, and I don't want to give you an answer that's only a half answer. I think, you know, we can take that offline and get an answer to that individual. Absolutely happy to do that, but I wouldn't want to provide something that's not useful.
From a legal aid perspective, my view is part of a hardship arrangement is how you get out the other side, and getting out the other side has got to be achievable for the person. And if it's not achievable for the person, I'm not sure it's an adequate hardship arrangement. That's just a legal aid view.
Okay.
All right. We are now well short of time.
I'm just going to pop it here. Thank you so much, everyone, for your comments and your questions, and thank you very much to Paul, Bill, and Dion for your very insightful conversation today. If we didn't get to your questions, our presenters have very kindly agreed to answer questions that get sent through to us, if they can. So if you would like to send any more through to webinars@legalaid.qld.gov.au, I'll make sure they get through to the right people. I did just want to mention Legal Aid does have a new brochure out, the Disaster Legal Help Tips brochure. That one is going to be attached to the webinar today. That'll come out in an email after the webinar, and will be available online quite soon. And our Disaster Legal Help phone number is there as well. If you need to contact us for any other legal issues, there's our contact numbers there, and they are going to be on the handouts. I know I'm breezing through these. We've also got lots of publications and information available for free if you're looking for some other information that we didn't get to today. One last plug before we go. I also just wanted to quickly thank our Auslan interpreters. Thank you so much for making our webinars accessible. And join us next month for our webinar on financial hardship, which might link quite well into this one. That was really quick. I'm really sorry, but we did run out of time. There was so much good information discussed during this webinar. I really hope you've found out some answers to your questions today. Thank you again.
Thanks, everyone.